Here I'm going to talk about this really famous essay by Blaise Pascal that he just calls The Wager. And it's frequently referred to as Pascal's Wager. And this is an interesting argument regarding theology, regarding belief in God. And it's interesting largely because Pascal's actually not arguing in favor of the existence of God. That is, his argument is not trying to convince us that God exists or that any divine being exists. Instead, he's arguing that we should believe in the existence of God, whether he does or not, whether God exists or not. So it's a good bet. It's a good wager to place on the existence of God, as we'll see. So Blaise Pascal was a really significant figure during the European Renaissance. He was one of these people that did work in sciences and philosophy and all sorts of different areas of academia. His mathematical contributions included work on probability and betting strategies, which makes sense given that Pascal's Wager is sort of the famous essay that we're looking at here. So after that miscellaneous historical background information, let's move on to his actual argument here that's relevant. So a few preliminary remarks that Pascal makes before he gets into the meat of his argument. First is that while humans can kind of intellectually use the concept of infinity, it might actually be impossible for us to really grasp the infinite and fully understand something that is infinite. And of course, a divine being that he's talking about here, God, is an infinite being. So we can never really fully comprehend the infinite existence of a God. We can sort of intellectually grasp the basics of it, but we can't really fully understand it. Which leads to a second point, which is that attempts to prove that God does exist are really never going to fully work. We're never going to have an absolute proof of the existence of God that would convince, say, a committed atheist. And that ultimately, Pascal's essay here, his argument is directed towards atheists. It's going to be directed towards unbelievers, right, towards disbelievers. So he thinks it's really kind of misguided for other people. There's been many, many different attempts to prove that God exists. He thinks that those are all ultimately going to fail. But perhaps more importantly, they are misguided in a different way, that they sort of miss the point of religion and believing in God, that it's supposed to be faith in God, and faith is belief despite the lack of proof. So if the only way you're going to believe in God is if you have proof of God's existence, or you're just spending your time somehow trying to come up with a proof of the existence of God, then you're kind of missing the point in an important way. You are not relying on faith, and faith is absolutely integral to religion, thinks Pascal, and a lot of other people think that as well. So he thinks that people should just sort of avoid trying to prove or disprove the existence of God. It's not going to work, and it just sort of misses the point. Okay, so we got here, no definitive evidence either way, but he's going to argue that even though we don't really know, and we can never really know whether God actually exists or not, given the options, your best bet, based on your own self-interest, it's rational for you to go ahead and believe in God anyway. So that's a big part of what makes Pascal's argument so interesting and so famous and historically significant. So let's look at the options here, right? So we've got two options, says Pascal. God either exists or God does not exist, right? Those are the two options for existence, for reality. Then you have two betting strategies, so to speak. You could either believe or you could not believe. Now, Pascal spends some time talking about how somebody might say, well, I'm agnostic. right? Like I don't really believe that God exists, but I don't really believe that God doesn't exist. I'm kind of withholding my judgment because I acknowledge I don't have good reasons for either side. Well, Pascal points out that such a person actually belongs in the do not believe category, right? Because over here in the believe category on the left, that is somebody who actively believes that God exists. The agnostic does not actively believe that God exists. So they belong in the does not believe category, right? And so you really have no choice here. That is, you have no choice about whether to choose, right? You automatically fall into one of these two categories no matter what. You can't avoid the bet. Okay, so if we want to put these options for reality and your betting strategies into something that resembles like kind of contemporary game theory format. In game theory, we like to put things into like a grid, with these quadrants. And up here at the top, we've got the two options for how reality could turn out. And then on the left-hand side here, we've got your two betting strategies. So if you believe, and it turns out that God exists, then the result is you go to heaven, right? You spend eternity with God. And that's clearly intended to be a massively good outcome, right? The best possible outcome for sure. But on the other hand, if you believe, but God does not exist, then you're in the top right quadrant here. And when you die, you just die. There's no afterlife, and so there's no real negative or positive there. It's just a neutral death. Then down here for the do not believe option, if you do not believe and God turns out to exist, then you've got the really bad option, right? The worst possible option, that you go to hell. And sort of the more modern version of that is eternal suffering, active suffering in this really hideous way. Now, Pascal described this really just as spending an eternity away from God. So it wasn't sort of this active torture version of hell. But nevertheless, eternal life, eternal afterlife away from God is still a kind of torture, right? You're just, excluded from the eternal bliss of being with God. And so that's a strong negative, even though it's not sort of this active, pitchforks and, flesh melting off and all the horrible stuff associated with a more modern conception of hell. Anyway, then also if you do not believe and God does not exist, then just like with the believe option, it's sort of neutral, right? You just die and then that's it. Okay, so that's Pascal's initial setup, and it seems pretty clear that for the God does not exist, it really kind of doesn't matter if you believe or don't believe, so we can set that aside. But then for the God exists option, overwhelmingly the believe in God option is way better, right? You have at least the possibility of going to heaven, and you avoid the possibility of going to hell, so it seems pretty clear that just based on your own self-interest, the rational choice is to go ahead and believe. Now, the atheist might object here and say, well, hold on, it's not just a matter of the afterlife. You live sort of a regular life as well. So we have to factor that in. So let's say, you believe, you live your life as a believer, but it turns out that God does not exist. So we might need to add something else in here to the upper right-hand quadrant that, that you don't have to live your life as a Christian, right? You don't have to go to church, you don't have to follow the rituals, you don't have to live by the moral restrictions associated with Christianity. You can do sort of all the fun things and spend your free time as you want, various kinds of debauchery that would sort of be forbidden under Christianity. And so that would be a good thing. Plus, if you're a believer and God does not exist, then that means you're wrong, right? You were wrong about sort of some very significant thing about reality. And so that's kind of a negative as well. But then on the other hand, if you do not believe, you do not live your life as a Christian, and it turns out God does not exist, then you do get to sort of do all the fun things that Christianity says you're not allowed to do, and you're right, you are correct, and so that also seems like a good thing. So there's some debate then over how we should sort of treat these other the right-hand column. As Pascal describes it, if you do not believe in God, you get to indulge your passions, right? Drinking and debauchery, all those kinds of things, all those fun things that you get to do if you don't have to abide by Christian morality. So we have to include that in there as well. And so there's some room for debate, not so much on the left-hand column, right? Clearly, an infinite afterlife in heaven is the best, an infinite afterlife in hell is the worst, but what are these two over here? Is the top right second or third? The atheist might argue that it's sort of the third best option because you have to spend all this time going to church for what it turns out to be no reason. You have to restrict sort of your range of pleasurable activities for what turns out to be no reason. So that seems bad to the atheist, whereas the atheist will say down here, this is the second best option because you get to have fun, right? Or more fun at least, and do all the things that the atheist gets to do that maybe the Christian doesn't get to do. And you don't sort of, from the atheist perspective, waste your time going to church and following all the rituals and so on. Now, Pascal does make the argument that living a Christian life, even if it turns out there's no God, that living a Christian lifestyle is actually better than living the atheistic lifestyle. We'll get back to his details as to why he believes that in just a little bit. But he thinks that the Christian lifestyle might sound less fun, but it actually is better, living a more wholesome, regular life. Okay. So this is more what Pascal says, right? You live a better life if you're a believer, you live a worse life if you're a disbeliever, plus there's the possibility that God does exist, which is massive, infinite consequences in the afterlife. So to borrow some contemporary game theory terminology, the believe option here is the dominant strategy. That is, according to Pascal's way of setting this up, you do better by believing whether God exists or God does not exist. Both options are better than both of in the bottom row here. So he thinks he's made the case, you should believe, right? Well, the atheist is still going to complain a little bit and say, well, it just seems so dramatic, right? What's going on in your regular life as to whether you get to sort of do the fun things that Christianity says you can't do. But just to re-emphasize, the afterlife is an infinity, right? It's eternity, while your regular life is finite, right? Several decades, maybe 60, 70, 80 years, maybe a few more. So compared to the infinite afterlife, your regular finite life starts to seem pretty insignificant. So again, just more reason for thinking that the belief option is the dominant strategy here. Now, we might say it's sort of a risk-averse strategy, right? You don't want to risk the infinite badness of disbelief and ending up in hell. But then you also want to hold open the possibility of infinite goodness in the afterlife if God does exist. So, yeah, seems like you should believe. But then the atheist says, oh gosh, I'm an atheist, so I really think that God doesn't exist. Now, the atheist, if they're being honest, they should acknowledge that they don't have absolute proof that God does not exist. So they have to acknowledge that there's at least a very small probability that God exists, even in the mind of the atheist. But they would say, it's such a small probability that God exists that I should just discount, just forget about the possibility that he exists at all because it's so small of a probability. Well, Pascal says maybe so, right? Maybe the atheist will think that way, but nevertheless, since we're talking about an infinite afterlife, that then when we think about sort of the cost-benefit analysis, the risk-reward kind of analysis, the risk of an infinitely bad afterlife is so dramatic that even if the probability that God exists is really small, considering we're talking about an infinite afterlife, we should still believe in God just in case, right? Because you want to avoid that infinite badness and try to leave open the possibility of the infinite goodness, right? An infinity of afterlife multiplied by any small probability is still going to give you an infinity, right? And so it seems like you're still facing infinite considerations here. So if we want to put it kind of into premise conclusion format, it would look something like this. God either exists or does not exist. There's no deductively sound argument. There's no proof for or against God's existence. So both of them are an open possibility. And then self-interest, right? Rational self-interest favors belief in God's existence. Therefore, you should believe that God exists. Okay, so there's his overall argument. Now, still, the atheist might say, gosh, Pascal, you've got a really convincing argument here, right? I'm convinced that your conclusion is true. I should believe that God exists. It's in my rational self-interest to believe that God exists. But it's not like I can just take my chips, right, my betting chips, and place it in the betting square that says believe in God, right? It's not like that. If they truly are an atheist, then they actively believe that God doesn't exist. And they can't just sort of flip a switch in their head to flip it to believe, right? So here's the objection, right, coming from the atheist. I can't just suddenly decide to start believing in God just because I'm convinced by Pascal's argument. So what am I supposed to do? I feel a little stuck, right? I'm worried about going to hell, and I really want to leave open the possibility of going to heaven, but I'm not a believer. So what do I do? Well, Pascal's got some advice. You should just go ahead and live your life in a community of believers and live how they do. Go to the services, go through the rituals, just be a part of the community. And it might take a while, might even take years of doing this, but eventually, Pascal suggests, you will absorb sort of the attitudes and the beliefs of that community, and you will become a believer in God. And then you're on the right track. And then here is also where Pascal describes why it's actually better to live your life as a Christian, even if it turns out that there is no God. He thinks that your life will be more fulfilling overall if you're a Christian than if you're an atheist. You will be more faithful, humble, grateful, generous, a more sincere friend, more truthful, et cetera, et cetera. You'll have all these virtuous personality characteristics if you're a Christian. And if you're an atheist who thinks you won't have those. There seems pretty clearly a lot of room for debate there. It seems perfectly possible. And we have lots of examples of atheists who do have these virtuous personality traits. And then also some Christians, or at least people who claim to be Christians, who fail to have a lot of those personality traits. But nevertheless, this is the case that Pascal tries to make, that even if God doesn't exist, you'll actually do better if you live your life as a believer than if you live your life as an atheist. Okay. Well, so it looks like the atheist is sort of pushed into sort of at least trying to believe in God. But they've got one more objection, one that maybe is going to stick a little better than the last ones. And it's that the first premise of Pascal's argument might be what's called a false dichotomy. So let's go back and look at his first premise. God either exists or does not exist, right? These are the only two possibilities, Pascal says. Like, well, hold on. It's not just God exists or does not exist. What Pascal is saying is the Christian God exists or the Christian God does not exist. But of course, there's a wide variety of other religions that include at least one divine being, in some cases more than one divine being. And he's not including those as an option, right? So it's really not just these two options, either believe in the Christian God or don't believe in the Christian God. You could believe in, Hinduism or Buddhism or, the wide variety of other religions that there are in the world. So that's why the complaint here is that this might be a case of a false dichotomy. And this is a problem because even if you're sort of convinced by Pascal's argument, it's like, okay, I better start believing in God because I want to avoid the possibility of an infinitely bad afterlife, and I want to leave open the possibility of an infinitely good afterlife. But now I'm wondering, like, which of the various available gods should I believe in? I can't believe in more than one, right? They're mutually exclusive. So if I end up believing in the God that Pascal wants me to believe in, well, that could turn out to be the wrong God, right? It could be that some other religion turns out to be the correct religion. And now I've got it wrong, and I end up in the infinitely bad result, even though I was following Pascal's recommendations. So I'm a little stuck. How do I sort from among the different religious options which is the correct one? It doesn't seem like we've got a good way of doing that. Although Pascal does spend some time at the end of his essay trying to convince his readers that Christianity really is the only viable option for religious belief. Now, this might seem weird considering the fact that right at the beginning of his essay, he said any argument in favor of the existence of God, that is, any attempt to prove that God exists, is ultimately going to fail. But then at the end of the essay, he's trying to convince us that Christianity is the only possible religion. So that seems weird, right? Such arguments are doomed to fail. Maybe he can come up with some reasons why he thinks Christianity is better than other religions, but that's never going to amount to proof. And so he can't close off the possibility that one or more of these other religions, or some other religion that nobody's thought about, right? Maybe a divine being exists that's quite different than any established religion has set up, right? That there is no established known religion that sort of gets it exactly right for what the divine being actually is. And so there's all these different possibilities, and he cannot close off those possibilities. He can't prove that they are have zero probability of being correct. So he's kind of stuck a little bit here. All right, so that's why this was sort of a one of the more famous arguments concerning theology. But again, it's not an argument that God exists. It's merely an argument that we should believe that God exists.